Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you to all of you for showing up tonight. Gabrielle and I were talking the other day. We have about 20 minutes, and we want to leave time for Q&A. And we realized we don't want to subject any of you to this, but we could actually do like a 2-day conference, just the two of us talking about all of our psychopathologies. And so I don't know how many of you remember Monty Python's skit back in the 70s, and now for something completely different. A man with 3 buttocks. I think we only have 4 buttocks totally between the 4 of us. But what we're here as, between the 2 of us, we've both written books. Gabrielle's fantastic book on women and drinking, and her fantastic article a year ago, and a little bit more for The Atlantic about the false promise of Alcoholics Anonymous had a huge impact. Obviously, I've written my own book called My Age of Anxiety, and the focus of today is on policy and prescription and what we can do, and we're going to get into some of that because that's really important. But the real reason we're here is that even though Gabrielle is, as I say, the author of that acclaimed book and much other award-winning journalism, and a graduate of Stanford undergraduate and a Stanford master's in history, and I went to Harvard, and I'm the editor of The Atlantic, and we can all talk from that perspective. And between the 2 of us, we probably spent 10 years researching mental illness and psychopathology in its various formats. But we are, between the 2 of us, probably have, we could take the whole session just listing the things that we suffer from, and without saying who's who and what's what and who has what. We've got eating disorder, OCD, maybe times 2, multiple species of anxiety disorder, depression. I'm forgetting I'm forgetting things here.
PTSD.
And so the subject of this session is to talk about, how do you find the right standard of care, and particularly for people who are underserved communities who don't necessarily have access, or there are stigmas and sort of cultural impediments to seeking that. But here we are, who are from Stanford and Harvard and living in Italy, and we have had extraordinary difficulty in trying to find the right treatment for what ails us at different times. And so I thought we'd turn this into you can all be part of our group therapy session. You could lie down if you want, I don't know.
Actually, Scott suggested that I come out and lie down on the couch, which may have been a little bit too much of a yuck, but.
But I should start by saying too that I think both of us agree, and especially in the context of a forum like this, are huge supporters of the psychiatric establishment and the psychological establishment, and generally speaking, the benefits of pharmacology, and yet it is so hard to figure out what will work for any given individual person at any given time. And this is much more, and I learned this in researching my book, and I talk about the litany of the many treatments and medications that I tried. By the way, we're both medicated to be up here, so we're fine. If we left with the producers kind of what we took, so if you need, if an ambulance comes, you can just give them the toxicology report. But I want to start by asking you. I mean, you have struggled with this on and off for many years, going back to childhood and up through college and until today, and you are as informed a consumer on this stuff as anyone. You've researched it, and yet you yourself have had all kinds of difficulty at times finding the right person to treat you with the right treatment at the right time. Could you give us a sense of some of the most egregious problems?
You and I talked about this the other day, and I have some trauma in my history, and I was told by a dear friend of mine who's a psychologist, oh, you need to see this guy. I live, not to brag, I live in New Jersey, but you need to see this guy at Columbia, and he really, this is his deal. He does EMDR, eye movement desensitization. I don't remember what it stands for, but he's the guru. You need to see this guy. So I went to see this guy, and it was an incredible schlep to get there, and I had to run from the bus station to go get to his office, which is by the UN, which made me nervous already because I was anxious about missing the appointment and anxious about the time, losing time of the 45-minute clock. And in the middle of the session, which is this intense therapy where you are trying to, are you familiar, is everybody familiar with EMDR? So it's this intimate
I am.
thing where you're looking at this, and he had a light box that looked like Phil Collins on the stereo, and and the buzzer would ring every session. I would go to, the buzzer would ring, and you'd have to let somebody in. And it took me, I thought, this guy's the guru, right? So I was convinced, and initially it did help me, but then I started getting really pissed off during the session, and I would leave more pissed off than I started. And I realized that, okay, this is not helping me. But it took me 3 months to get to that point. And I, as you pointed out, I'm a longtime consumer of getting help, pharmacological help, psychotherapy, and if we can't do it, how do people who don't have access, who have much more stigma than we do? We're two half Jews who are no stranger to, I mean, your anxiety comes from your mother's side of the family, as you pointed out.
I have wasp anxiety. You got Jew anxiety.
And we don't have, in our culture, it's not stigmatized to seek help, but still we have had these incredible difficulties, and the trial and error of medication, that what works, what doesn't work. Do you worry about developing a dependence if you're an anxious person and you have to take benzodiazepines like I just did this morning? I got up, I have my own ritual. I got up, I took my half of a Valium at 5:30. I took the other half of the Valium at 7 o'clock. Probably shouldn't have had coffee, but did that anyway. And it's really, there's no perfect path. The evidence base is so vast for finding the right recipe.
And we'll come back before we get to the end about the challenges that afflict people from underserved communities. From people, we are probably unusually blessed in having friends and access to kind of cutting edge psychopharmacology. Although even for us, as we've just heard, it can be. I'll tell my story, and then I'll ask you. I went for many years, starting when I was a child, to a reputable Harvard-affiliated psychiatrist, and he'd routinely fall asleep in meetings. And I was about 14 and 15 at the time, and I was very timid, and so I would just sit there quietly. And then the truly embarrassing thing is that the way he would usually wake up is he would pass gas. And he'd suddenly be like, oh, sorry, what? And of course, me being a dutiful 14-year-old patient, I would just sit there and look alert and ready for the next thing. But have you had other experiences that are kind of along those?
Well, I did have one. When I was about 9 and 10, I lost my great-grandfather, my grandfather, within very close succession. And being an anxious child, I was convinced that the reason that they had died in such quick succession was because I had killed them by touching too many black things. I was extremely superstitious, so I developed OCD completely, just full force for several years. And I would count the number of colored items that I touched in a certain day so as not to kill someone else. And finally, it really kind of broke down, and it just was easier to not eat. So I became sort of anorexic. And I went to a psychiatrist about this, and she told me it was I was probably like 13 or 14 at the time, and she said it was completely normal to eat a peach and a yogurt a day. And I was like, okay, I'm fine. We're ready to go. And that is not actually, that is really not good advice. I mean, I can tell you clinically, that was not sound and didn't help me at all.
Well, and so segueing from that to, you did a piece for NYC Radio this summer about a woman who'd written a book called Welcome to My Nervous Breakdown or something like that.
Welcome to My Breakdown.
Welcome to My Breakdown. And she'd published the book, and then you interviewed her, and it became fairly well known because of the broadcast. And she wrote to you in a panic saying, "Oh my God, I feel like I've outed myself, and I'm doomed." Stigma is still a problem, and this is, I think, one of the themes of today. You know, stigma is a problem generally.
Well, she's African American, so the piece was about underserved.
Well, that's what I want to say.
Yeah,
So like this, you know, stigma, in general, is still a problem for all classes and races of Americans. For African Americans, it's even higher, maybe significantly higher.
Oh, much.
And then for disadvantaged people of whatever color, they also just have much less access, even knowledge of what mental health services can provide. So talk a little bit about that.
In the African American community, my sources told me that, first of all, psychological problems are white people problems. And number one. Number two, if you have a problem, you stay within your own home, you stay within your own community, you stay within your church. You give your troubles to the traditional sources of support in the African American community. You do not go see, first of all, the number of black psychiatrists is in the single digits. It's something like 2%. The number of black social workers and psychologists is likewise in the single digits. So it's extremely difficult. There is a, I mean, we're laughing about the lack of therapeutic alliance, that's what they call it, that we have had.
Yep.
But if you are a person of color going to a white therapist, already there is potentially a big imbalance in the understanding. How do you make yourself understood? And you know, does this person really get me?
Well, you had this astonishing quote from her in your piece where she says, in the African American community, the sense is we endured slavery.
Right.
Whatever we're going through is nothing. Keep it to yourself. Understand the logic there, but that can be toxic to somebody who actually needs help.
Absolutely. And when people do seek help, something that I discovered, I talked to a woman who had been diagnosed as having schizophrenia. That's another important thing that we need to be aware of, is that the language that we use. To say someone is schizophrenic is now, you know, not used. So it's a person with schizophrenia. So this person had been diagnosed, this woman had been diagnosed with schizophrenia for 12 years and was medicated beyond all reason. She spent 12 years asleep going to an adult daycare program. Wow. She is now getting a PhD. Her partner advocated for her and said she does not have any of these symptoms. I think she's bipolar, so her partner diagnosed her.
Interesting.
And eventually, she did get the right care. She is medicated for her bipolar condition, but she lost 12 years of her life asleep on a couch doing, you know, coloring books at an adult daycare center. And African Americans are almost 3% more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than are people who are white. And the prevalence is not higher.
Wow.
That's an outrage.
We have about 52 seconds before we go to audience questions, so two lightning round questions. And one is, and this should not be a lightning round question because this could be the subject of next year's summit for a 3-day session, but what do we do about how do you assure, there's no Yelp for psychiatrists or psychiatric help. Do you have any preliminary thoughts about how to help people find the precise help they need? There's so many different kinds of treatment, so many different kinds of therapy, so many different kinds of drugs, and yet it's a crapshoot at all times. And the lower you are on the socioeconomic spectrum, probably the more random it is what you get assigned. 15 to 20 seconds on what you think
I think there should be tryout sessions. I think every therapist should just be generous and do one pro bono session. Do we like each other? Do you get me? Do I get you? Do you feel comfortable here? Good therapists will do that, but many won't. And I think that's crucial.
And then very last question, and again, this is way too compressed for us to be able to address in any depth, but just over a year ago, you published a fantastic piece that was one of our most read pieces of last year called The False Promise of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know you got a tremendous, tremendous response, both of criticism from defenders of AA and also then from people who had written to you to say, you've helped me so much. Do you have any sort of distilled thoughts on what the experience of publishing that piece and what the reaction was?
I was a little surprised. I was a little alarmed by the hatred that came initially. You and I had a talk a year ago, and people were watching it. I think it was live streamed. I opened up my Twitter feed, and it was just threats of sexual violence. Seven people called me a spinster, which
You're not even.
I don't care. It's kind of sticks and stones, dude. But what that piece showed me was how profound the need is. This was just one single mental health arena, which is alcohol use disorder. 18 million Americans suffer from it, and we have an over-reliance on a single method, in my opinion. And what it showed me was the desperate need for greater coverage of more mental health issues.
And one of the effects of the book, you were just telling me that, the idea is that medication can help with this, and the idea that this drug naltrexone, I think you said Tennessee and some other state is...
University of New Mexico and Vanderbilt.
It's Vanderbilt and University of Mexico are actually, making available for students. So we have a very brief amount of time for questions, so...
Gordon with the National Association of State Mental Health Programs. I hesitate to ask this question, Gabrielle, because I didn't read your article, but all my Atlantics are sitting at home, so I'll go home and read it. But 37 states cover peer support under their Medicaid programs. Have either of you had experience with peer support? Most of the peer support programs aim at the lower income folks, but have you guys had experience with that, and what were those experiences?
Personally, I have not. I am very fortunate to have a shutoff valve for alcohol. But my point in peer support groups, if AA works for somebody, that's terrific. But there are many, many, many other peer support groups, Smart Recovery, there's a group called Moderation Management, there are harm reduction groups that are both online and in person, and I think it's really crucial to educate people about those evidence-based models, which use cognitive behavioral therapy, something called motivational interviewing, which helps users resolve their ambivalence about drinking or using drugs.
And I have not either. I've talked to a lot of people who talk about the benefits of this. I'm not close to the idea of doing it, but I recognize what the evidence says about what the benefits of these can be, particularly for certain forms of emotional disorders and so forth. So.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels, Ramsey Decisions. That was a absolutely moving account you gave on your experiences. I was wondering, you may have, the financial wherewithal to look for, an appropriate psychiatrist. How do you see this playing out in the reforms that are being proposed as were outlined earlier?
That's a brilliant question, and Scott and I have been talking about that, exploring that on at a much deeper level, because that's the question.
Kind of everything, and interfaces with ACA and what it provides in terms of support. And my understanding, a little bit from reading Gabrielle's research, is that so far, as much good as ACA has done, it hasn't yet penetrated deep, particularly into underserved communities where people are just not aware of the help that's available to them. So, I don't know how many more questions do we have time for? One more. So right back there. Yeah.
Phyllis Hedlund, public educator in Washington, D.C. The politics of poverty work against our youth with mental illness, and it's something that my colleague and I face every day. And even when parents are willing to recognize that there is a problem, the inability to get pharmaceutical drugs on a regular basis, the inability to get a diagnosis, the inability to get off work to take the child to the doctor. I just feel, when we think about the school to prison pipeline, that is the number one issue that I see feeding that, and it's just heartbreaking to watch on a daily basis. And I don't know what sort of comment you have on that.
I mean, I'll go quickly first and then let Gabrielle talk. I completely agree with that, and that the evidence, I mean, from my own experience, but also the data that I've read from Harvard School of Public Health, is that for many forms of psychiatric disorders, early intervention with kids is so important, and being able to find them earlier. And it's, and actually the irony, is that it's easier to find the kids who have kind of behavior disorders or, impulsivity or ADHD because they're acting out in class. The anxious kid or the depressed kid is probably sitting in the class, not saying anything, and actually being a very good student, and nobody is noticing them. And the data suggests that without intervention, the odds that the 5-year-old who is socially anxious in school, afraid of dogs, afraid of the dark, is X% more likely to grow up to have social anxiety as a teenager and then to develop panic disorder as an adult, and then are that much more likely than their peers to become drug addicted and have all kinds of other pathologies. And intervention at that stage can have a profound impact in sort of heading them off at the pass. And that's true of all kids, and it's hard for kids of anywhere across the income spectrum, but particularly those who are in underserved communities who may be dealing with trauma and difficult home environments. And I think that has to be a focus of public policy moving forward. So,
I couldn't agree more. I've spent the last year with a lot of people who are addicted to heroin, covering the heroin crisis, and the number of these young men, and it's typically young men, who had social anxiety as a 4th grader. They remember having to give a report about a president in 4th grade, and it was the moment that their shame overcame them. And it moved to marijuana, to opioids, prescription opioids, because sports were a great outlet for them. They discovered that Vicodin made them feel better than anything ever in their whole lives. And then the next thing they knew, they lost 10 years to heroin. So the most important thing, it's a fantastic question, is identifying those children and identifying their issues early on and not shoving them into some behavioral pipeline. Oh, this is an ADHD kid who needs to be medicated. No, this is a kid who needs some cognitive behavioral therapy or some form of evidence-based treatment that is going to help him or her identify his anxiety, his triggers, and learn to calm himself down. Preferably not with Valium at the age of 9.
Yep, agreed. Well, I think we're out of time, so thank you all very much for your time and attention, and thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you.